Hello. Today I want to talk about narrative fiction. Let's think about the word fiction. If I were to ask most people what fiction means, they would say something that's not true. When discussing the literary term fiction, the idea that a story is not true is misleading. While it's true that fictional stories are not based on actual events, their underlying truth is revealed in the details of character and plot. Stories spring from authors' observations and experiences of real life, along with their imaginations. Thus, the fictional story indeed describes reality. The author creates this alternate reality through skillful use of the elements of narrative fiction, our subject for today. We're going to focus on four elements of fiction: character, plot, setting, and theme. In addition, we'll examine the way authors use techniques such as symbolism, irony, dialogue, and point of view to tell their story. Character development. Character is the focal point of the story. A character is a person created by the author to help tell a story. Authors develop characters through character traits. Think of a trait as a description of a person in real life. You might describe your neighbor, for example, as friendly, helpful, generous, and honest. Or you might describe this neighbor as hostile, malicious, stingy, and dishonest. Those are all personality traits. We can describe characters in a story in the same way, calling those descriptors character traits. We describe characters not only by how many traits they have, but whether these traits change as a result of the story's action. A flat character has few traits. A complex character has many traits, and those traits might even be contradictory. A stock character has only one or two traits, only what is needed to move the action or to perform the action in a story. We also describe character traits by the way they are presented by the author. An author might present the character directly, speaking as the author or narrator. This is more common in the 19th century novels, such as those by Charles Dickens. The narrator not only describes the physical appearance of the character, but also the character traits. For example, Charles Dickens tells us on the first page of A Christmas Carol that Ebenezer Scrooge was, quote, not so dreadfully cut up by the sad events, that is, Marley's funeral, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. That's a lot of information about Scrooge in a very short sentence. In modern fiction, since the late 19th and into the 20th century, authors are more likely to present characters dramatically, that is, through what the character says and does and, since this is fiction, thinks. This more closely mirrors how we learn about people in real life. A character might also be revealed by what other characters say about him or her in the form of gossip. This introduces a complication, however. How reliable is the gossiping character? Does the information revealed tell more about the teller than the target of the gossip? Keep in mind, however, this uncertainty is not a flaw of the story, but rather an element that the author is purposely using. We can also learn about characters by how they relate to other characters. Again, think about Ebenezer Scrooge. He treated others so badly that it warranted visits by 3 ghosts in one night. Finally, we must consider how the events of the story affect the characters. Again, a static character is relatively unaffected, and their traits remain constant from beginning to the end of the story. A dynamic character, however, changes traits dramatically as a result of the action of the story. Let's talk about plot. We generally define plot as what happens in the story, and that's generally true. It's not quite as simple as all that, though. The plot is the structure of the story, and analyzing it involves several steps. First step, ask some questions. Who is the main character? That character we'll call the protagonist. Keep in mind that when used as a literary term, the protagonist is not necessarily the good guy. The protagonist is simply the central or main character in the story. What does the protagonist really want? This is a difficult question because to be valuable, you must go deeper than first appearances. Now ask who or what is working against the protagonist's desire. That person or force is called the antagonist. Again, remember that the word antagonist carries no moral judgment. The antagonist is not necessarily the bad guy in the story. Finally, the relationship between the protagonist and the antagonist is called the conflict. Conflict powers the plot. Have you ever read a good story that had no problems? Sometimes the conflict is external, as when it results from a struggle between the protagonist and someone or something outside the protagonist. Sometimes, however, conflict may be internal, as when it results from the protagonist wanting contradictory things or embroiled in a moral dilemma. Looking at this chart, which I call Plot Mountain, you can see a visual representation of the story events that grow out of the conflict. The story builds through a series of events called rising action until it reaches the climax, where the conflict is ended. Someone wins and someone loses the struggle. Often the word climax means the most exciting moment in a story, and it may be, but it is actually when the struggle ends. Sometimes the climax occurs off stage. After the climax, we see a series of events, usually very few, that involve tying up loose ends. This is the falling action. It happens after the struggle ends. Within the falling action, the author often presents, through the narrator or possibly through a character, a statement of theme, the point of the story, maybe the moral of the story. Setting. We can define setting in a number of ways, all of which may have an enormous effect on the story's development. Setting can be a place where the story happens. It can be very local and specific, maybe a room, or it might be the neighborhood, or it might be the city, or the state, or the country, or the continent, or the world, or, in science fiction, the galaxy. Setting can also be the time of the story. Like setting as place, we can speak of setting as being the time of day, the month, the season, or even a historical era, or possibly the future. Setting can also refer to culture. A story set in 19th century Eastern European village would be very different from, say, the same story only set in 20th century Brooklyn, New York. Other narrative tools that an author might use include symbolism, irony, and point of view. A symbol might be the cultural symbol, which is generally understood to represent a specific idea. Thus, the Stars and Stripes represent the United States of America, not only the physical place, but also its values and aspirations, as well as its shortcomings. Other cultural symbols represent specific religions, as shown by the Star of David, the cross, and the crescent moon and star. Other symbols are temporary and created by authors to represent important ideas in their story. They do this by describing an object or an action, frequently and in context. Irony is when things are not as they appear to be. We're all familiar with comedies that are based on irony. Finally, point of view. Point of view is how a story is told. It may be by a narrator, but then you have to ask what kind of narrator. Some narrators see and know everything. We call these omniscient narrators. Others have more limited knowledge and field of vision. They're limited narrators. The story may also be told by a character. In this case, again, reliability is at issue. This is the first-person narrative, and sometimes the protagonist or the antagonist tells the story. Again, the storyteller's scope of knowledge and his or her bias can profoundly affect our understanding of the author's message. Keep your notes about the element of fiction at hand when you read, discuss, and write about the stories we will enjoy this term.